The mother grizzly pushed through the deep snow, her massive body aching with exhaustion. Her 3 cubs, shivering and weak, stumbled behind her, their small paws barely breaking the frozen crust beneath them. The cold was unforgiving, seeping into their bones, and for the first time she felt the crushing weight of desperation. She had to find shelter, no matter where it led her. The Yukon wilderness lay beneath a suffocating blanket of snow, landscape frozen in a cruel and unforgiving stillness. The wind howled through the valley, a relentless force that carried ice like shards of glass, slicing through anything exposed. The sky, a vast and endless grey, offered no relief, no promise of warmth. Trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with frost, bowing under the crushing weight of winter. The river, once a lifeline, had turned into an unbroken sheet of ice, lifeless and still. Nothing moved except the wind, the snow, and the creatures desperate enough to fight against nature's merciless grip. Among them, a mother grizzly trudged forward, her powerful frame weakened by hunger and exhaustion. Her thick fur, once a natural armor against the cold, was now coated in frost, and her breath rose in ragged clouds. Each step was an effort, her massive paws sinking into the snow, dragging through the deep drifts that seemed determined to swallow her whole. Behind her, 3 small figures stumbled after her, their tiny bodies shivering, their legs barely able to carry them forward. The cubs, no more than a few months old, had already faced more hardship than they should have. They were meant to be curled up in the warmth of their den, nestled against their mother's body, waiting for spring. But fate had stolen that safety from them. The den had collapsed days ago, buried under a sudden avalanche of ice and rock. The mother had clawed desperately at the frozen earth, trying to dig through the rubble, her heart pounding with panic. But the more she dug, the more she understood there was no saving it. The entrance was sealed, and with it, their only chance of shelter. She had no choice but to move, to search for something, anything that could keep her cubs alive. The wild was not kind to the weak, and she knew that if she stopped, if she gave in to exhaustion, the cold would take them. Food was scarce. The river was frozen solid, the fish beneath it unreachable. The land offered nothing but snow, ice, and death. She had tried digging, searching for anything buried beneath the frost roots, frozen berries, even a carcass abandoned by another predator, but the ground was unyielding, locked in winter's grip. The cubs cried softly as they walked, their tiny paws sinking deep into the snow, their bodies trembling. She pressed forward, her instinct screaming at her to find shelter, to find warmth before it was too late. The wind shifted, carrying with it something foreign, something unexpected. It was faint, almost lost in the biting air, but it was their smoke. A scent unnatural to the wilderness, something warm, something alive. She lifted her heavy head, nostrils flaring, tracking the source. Through the thick curtain of falling snow, her dark eyes caught something in the distance, barely visible through the storm. A structure standing against the white, its windows glowing dimly like embers buried in ash. The mother hesitated, her instincts warring within her. She had spent her life avoiding the world of men. They were dangerous, unpredictable, but she had never been this desperate. Her cubs were slowing, their tiny bodies faltering with each step. If she turned away now, she knew what would happen. They would collapse, their small hearts slowing, their breaths growing weaker until the cold claimed them. She had no choice. With a final glance at the 3 fragile lives trailing behind her, she pressed forward, towards the only thing in this frozen wasteland that promised survival. Daniel Carter had spent most of his life studying the wilderness, yet he had never felt more at home than in solitude. In his late 50s, he had chosen this life deliberately, retreating from the noise of civilization to find solace in the rhythm of nature. A retired wildlife biologist, he had spent decades researching the behavior of animals, particularly bears, fascinated by their intelligence, their instincts, their quiet dominion over the land. He had observed them from afar, tracking their movements, recording their habits, always maintaining a respectful distance. Never had he imagined one would come to him, standing at his doorstep, asking for something he wasn't sure he could give. His cabin stood in the middle of nowhere, nestled deep within the Yukon wilderness, where winters stretched endlessly, and the world seemed frozen in time. The isolation didn't bother him, was what he had wanted. He had left behind the city, the people, the obligations of modern life, in search of something simpler, something real. Out here, life was reduced to its essentials: food, warmth, survival. The days were spent chopping wood, hauling water, and keeping the fire burning. Every piece of firewood was a necessity, every meal rationed with care. There were no luxuries in this life, only the steady rhythm of existence. Outside, the cold was relentless, the air so frigid it burned his throat when he breathed. The wind rattled the wooden walls of his cabin, howling through the trees like a living thing. He had grown used to it, used to the way the wind never truly stopped, the way the snow piled higher each day, burying the world beneath its weight. The loneliness was a companion rather than a burden. He had chosen this place because it asked nothing of him except patience and respect. He had always admired the resilience of the animals that shared this land, their ability to endure conditions that would break most men. The wolves, the caribou, the foxes, they had all adapted to the cold, each in their own way. But the bears were different. They were masters of survival, knowing when to disappear into the depths of the earth, slipping into hibernation as the world around them froze. This time of year they should have been in their dens, hidden away from the storm. He had spent the evening as he always did, sitting by the fire, listening to the crackling of the wood, the only sound inside the cabin. Outside, the wind howled, pressing against the walls, but he paid it little mind. He had grown accustomed to the way the storm played against his senses, whispering and groaning, filling the silence with its presence. He sat with a book in his hands, though he hadn't turned a page in a while. His mind wandered, thoughts drifting to warmer places, to memories of a life that now felt distant. Then he heard it, something beyond the wind, something heavier, something alive. At first, he dismissed it as nothing more than the groaning of the trees, the shifting of snow as it piled against his cabin. But then it came again, a faint rustling, a presence just beyond the wooden walls. He stiffened, listening intently, every sense alert. It was not the wind, it was something moving, something large. He set his book aside, moving toward the window with slow, measured steps. The glass was fogged from the heat inside, and he wiped it with the sleeve of his shirt, peering out into the dark. The storm had thickened, snow falling in relentless sheets, making it difficult to see anything beyond the glow of the firelight reflecting off the drifts. For a moment, he saw nothing. Just the endless white, the swirling wind carving patterns into the snow. Then movement. A shadow emerged from the storm, large and heavy, barely visible against the whiteness of the landscape. His breath caught in his throat as his eyes adjusted, as the shape took form. It was a bear. The realization sent a jolt of instinctive fear through him, though he remained perfectly still, watching. It was massive, its thick fur coated in ice, clinging to its body in stiff patches. The weight of the snow on its back made it appear ghostly, almost unreal. And then he saw them, the three small figures pressed against her legs, barely visible in the snow. Cubs. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. This wasn't right. This wasn't how things were supposed to be. Bears did not wander through storms like this. They should have been safe in their den, curled up in sleep, waiting for the winter to pass. Yet here they were, standing just outside his cabin, the mother's breath rising in heavy clouds, her cubs shivering at her side. For a long moment he simply stared, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. She was close, too close. He had spent years studying these creatures, understanding their behaviors, their warning signs, and yet none of that prepared him for the reality of seeing one at his door. The risks were undeniable. A desperate bear was dangerous, unpredictable. If she decided he was a threat, If she lashed out in fear or hunger, there was little he could do. But she did not move toward him. She stood still, her eyes locked onto his, dark and unreadable. There was no growl, no display of aggression, just a quiet, watching presence. He had seen bears look at him before, from the distance of a field journal, from the safety of a camera lens, but never like this. Never with this kind of weight. She was not here to attack. She was here because she had nowhere else to go. Something deep inside him stirred, something that went against logic, against instinct. He had always believed in letting nature take its course, in not interfering with the way things were meant to be. He had lived by that rule for years, observing rather than acting, accepting the brutality of the wild without question. And yet, as he stood there, staring at the frost-covered grizzly and her 3 trembling cubs, he felt something shift inside him. They were dying. He could see it in the way the cubs barely moved, their tiny bodies barely able to fight against the cold. He could see it in the way the mother stood, exhausted but unyielding, her strength waning with every breath. The rational part of him screamed to stay inside, to wait them out, to let nature decide their fate. But another part of him, something deeper, something more human, whispered a different truth. They had come to his door, and he wasn't sure he had the heart to turn them away. The moment Daniel opened the door, the cold pushed in like a living force, biting at his skin, filling the cabin with a rush of frozen air. The wind howled through the trees, sending flurries of snow spiraling into the dim light of the room. He stood there, his breath hanging in the air, his muscles tense. The mother bear did not move. She remained on the threshold, her massive body framed against the blizzard, her dark eyes locked onto his. Her breath came in slow, heavy clouds, her fur crusted in ice, her body stiff with exhaustion. Everything in Daniel's mind screamed that this was a mistake, that he was inviting danger into his home, that this could not end well. And yet, he did not close the door. The warmth from inside seeped out, touching the frozen figures before him. The cubs, barely standing, shivered violently. Their small bodies sagged with fatigue, their tiny faces etched with something beyond fear, something close to surrender. They did not have the strength to hesitate. One of them, the smallest, collapsed forward into the doorway, its paws slipping against the wooden floor. Instinct took over. The mother moved, not to attack, but to shield. Her heavy head lowered, her breath warm against the cub's fragile body. Still, she did not lunge. She did not growl. She hesitated, sniffing the warm air wafting from inside. Her body trembled, muscles taut, ready to flee, ready to fight, waiting for something she did not understand. Daniel took a slow step back. He did not reach for his rifle. He did not make a sound. He simply let the door remain open. One by one, the cubs stumbled inside, too weak to resist the promise of warmth. They collapsed onto the wooden floor, their small bodies curling into themselves, too exhausted to move. Their fur, brittle with frost, began to thaw in the heat of the fire. The mother took a step forward, then another. Her massive frame barely fit through the doorway. Every part of her bristled with tension, her muscles twitching, but she did not turn back into the storm. She placed herself between her cubs and the stranger, watching him, waiting for any sign of betrayal. Daniel moved slowly, never making a sudden motion. He backed away, giving her space. She was close enough now that he could feel the heat radiating off her body, despite the ice that clung to her fur. Her breath, deep and slow, filled the space between them. They stood like that for what felt like hours, neither moving, neither speaking. A silent agreement hung between them, fragile, dangerous, but real. Daniel knew she would not let him near her cubs. Not yet. He also knew they needed more than just warmth. They needed food, strength. He glanced toward the shelf near the far wall where he kept his supplies. It was a gamble, but if he did nothing, the cubs wouldn't last the night. Moving with deliberate slowness, he stepped towards the shelf, keeping his eyes down, not wanting to provoke a reaction. He reached for an old bundle of dried fish, the remnants of a catch from weeks ago. His fingers curled around a strip of preserved meat. He turned, moving back to the center of the room, and set it down on the far side, away from himself, away from the fire. He stepped back. The mother did not move at first. She watched him, her body still rigid, her breath deep and steady. But then her nose twitched, catching the scent of food. Her eyes flicked towards the offering, then back to him. She hesitated. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she stepped forward. She did not lunge, she did not growl, she did not bare her teeth. She took the food. Daniel exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The night stretched on in silence. The fire crackled, its light flickering across the cabin walls. The mother bear remained alert, her body curled protectively around her cubs. She did not sleep, not yet, but she did not attack either. She watched Daniel with wary eyes, her breaths deep and slow. The cubs, unable to fight their exhaustion, had already given in. They lay close to the fire, their tiny bodies rising and falling in shallow, steady breaths. The ice in their fur had melted away, leaving damp patches on the wooden floor. Their small faces twitched in sleep, too tired to dream of anything but warmth. Daniel sat across the room, his back against the wall, his mind racing. He had spent his life studying these creatures, understanding their instincts, their behaviors. But nothing had prepared him for this. He watched as the mother stretched out slightly, still tense but no longer as rigid. Her ears flicked, her nose twitching as she continued to scent the air. Every part of her was still cautious, still aware. But she no longer looked at him as if he were the enemy. Hours passed. The storm raged outside, the wind howling, the snow battering against the cabin walls. Inside, the fire burned steadily, casting a golden glow over everything. The mother bear finally allowed herself to rest. She did not sleep, not fully, but her body eased slightly, no longer poised for immediate violence. She remained between Daniel and her cubs, her massive frame rising and falling with every breath. By the time the sun crept over the horizon, sending weak rays of light through the frost-covered windows, something had changed. The fear had not vanished entirely, but it had lessened. In the days that followed, the fragile truce remained. The mother no longer flinched every time Daniel moved. She no longer bristled when he gathered supplies or fed the fire. She watched him, always, but with less suspicion, with less doubt. The cubs, young and unaware of the weight of the moment, adjusted faster. They sniffed at his boots, blinked curiously at the fire, huddled close to the warmth without fear. They ate what little he could spare, their strength slowly returning. Daniel knew this was not a permanent arrangement. They could not stay forever. The wild was their home, not this cabin. But for now, for as long as the storm raged outside, for as long as the cold made the world unlivable, they remained. And neither man nor beast had the heart to break the silent truce they had formed. The days passed in a quiet rhythm, marked by the crackling of the fire, the occasional shifting of the mother bear, and the soft breathing of the cubs as they regained their strength. Outside, the storm showed no signs of relenting. The world beyond the cabin remained a frozen wasteland, buried under thick layers of snow and ice. Daniel knew this arrangement could not last forever. As much as he had come to accept their presence, and as much as the mother bear seemed to accept his, this was only temporary. The wilderness would call them back as soon as they were strong enough to answer. He sat by the radio, listening to the weather reports, static-filled voices, warning of worsening conditions. The storm had stretched across the region, cutting off roads and isolating the few scattered cabins that dotted the landscape. It was one of the worst winters in decades. Even experienced trappers were struggling to navigate through the deep snow. If it was this bad for humans, what hope did a mother bear and her cubs have? His fingers tapped absently against the wooden table as he thought. The moment the storm lifted, they would have to leave. He could not keep them here forever, no matter how much safer they were within these walls. But sending them back out into the wilderness, without a plan, felt like a death sentence. The mother bear was strong, but even she had sought out his help in desperation. If she had been pushed this far, it meant her survival instincts had told her there was no other way. Out there, beyond the warmth of the cabin, was a world that had nearly killed them. What would change once they stepped back into it? As he stared at the radio, lost in thought, an unexpected sound cut through the quiet. A knock at the door. It was not the wind, nor was it the scratching of a tree branch against the wooden panels. It was deliberate, a human hand. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He stood, his movements careful, his mind racing. The mother bear lifted her head, ears perked, her body instantly alert. She sensed the tension before he even touched the doorknob. When he pulled the door open, the cold rushed in, along with the sight of a man standing on his porch. He was bundled in heavy winter gear, his face partially covered by a thick scarf, but his eyes were sharp, assessing. He carried a rifle slung over his shoulder.
"Didn't think anyone was up here,"
the man said, stamping snow from his boots.
"Storm's bad. Was tracking something when I saw prints leading this way."
Daniel kept his expression neutral.
"What were you tracking?"
The hunter exhaled a cloud of breath, his gaze flicking past Daniel toward the interior of the cabin.
"Bear. A big one. Tracks led straight to your door. Figured I should warn you, dangerous to have one so close, especially in these conditions,"
he said. Daniel's pulse quickened, but he kept his stance relaxed. He leaned against the doorframe, blocking the view inside.
"Haven't seen anything."
The man narrowed his eyes slightly, as if weighing the truth of Daniel's words.
"That's so? Not sure where it could have gone then. Must be holed up somewhere nearby."
His hand rested lightly on his rifle strap. Daniel didn't reply. He could feel the mother bear's presence behind him, her breath steady but watchful. If the hunter stepped any closer, if he caught a glimpse of her massive frame or the cubs curled near the fire, there would be no hiding it. The man tilted his head, glancing past Daniel toward the snow-covered ground.
"You should be careful. A hungry bear this time of year, especially one with cubs, is unpredictable. If you see it, best not to hesitate."
He tapped his rifle.
"I won't."
A tension settled between them, thick as the frozen air. Daniel nodded slowly.
"Appreciate the warning."
The hunter lingered for a moment longer before stepping back.
"Storm's letting up in a few days. If you need supplies, best time to get out will be then. Stay safe."
He pulled his scarf higher over his face. With that, he turned and walked off into the snow, his boots crunching with each step. Daniel watched him disappear into the white haze before shutting the door, locking it behind him. Inside, the mother bear had not moved, but her eyes remained fixed on him, dark and unreadable. She had sensed the danger, the unspoken threat in the hunter's words. Daniel let out a slow breath. The world outside was no safer than it had been when she arrived. If anything, it was worse. He could not keep them here, but he could not let them walk out blindly either. That night, as the wind howled and the fire crackled, Daniel made a decision. If they were going to survive, they would need more than just a warm place to rest. They would need a chance once they were back in the wild. The next morning, he began his preparations. He rationed what little food he had left, setting aside extra portions of dried fish and cured meat that could sustain them in the days ahead. He melted snow into water, filling a small basin for the cubs to drink from. He dug through his supplies, searching for anything that could help. When he wasn't gathering food, he studied his maps, tracing paths through the wilderness, looking for the safest route they could take once the storm passed. There were valleys where the snow might be thinner, rivers where fish might still be found beneath the ice. There were places where they could go, where they might stand a better chance. He marked the paths with careful precision, memorizing the terrain, considering every possible danger. The mother bear watched him, as she always did, her gaze steady, unreadable. She did not understand what he was doing, but she no longer flinched when he moved around the cabin. The unspoken trust between them remained, fragile but unwavering. Days passed, and the storm began to wane. The relentless winds quieted, the thick snowfall easing into a steady, gentle drift. The world beyond the cabin was still frozen, still harsh, but it was no longer impassable. Daniel stood at the window, staring out into the endless white expanse. It was almost time. The mother bear stretched, her massive form rising, her muscles no longer stiff with exhaustion. She sniffed the air, sensing the change. She knew, too. Soon they would leave. He had done all he could. The rest was up to her. The storm had finally broken. The air remained bitterly cold, but the unrelenting winds had died down, and the sky had cleared to a crisp, pale blue. Sunlight reflected off the thick layers of snow, casting long shadows across the frozen wilderness. After nearly a week of sheltering inside the cabin, it was time. Daniel stood near the door, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. The fire crackled softly behind him, its warmth still reaching his back, but it would no longer be needed for the guests who had found solace here. The mother bear, strong once more, stood near the door, her dark eyes fixed on him with quiet understanding. She did not move immediately. There was no frantic rush to escape, no desperation in her stance. Instead, she simply waited, as if she understood that this was a farewell. The cubs, now steady on their feet, stood beside her, their fur no longer stiff with ice, their small bodies no longer trembling from exhaustion. They had been given a second chance, and the mother bear knew it. Daniel exhaled slowly, his breath forming a faint cloud in the cold air. He had known this day would come. He had prepared for it, accepted it, yet standing here now, with the door between them and the wild that had nearly taken their lives, he felt an unexpected heaviness settle in his chest. She took a step toward the door, then hesitated. Her large frame filled the space, and for a brief moment she did not look like a powerful predator or a creature driven by instinct alone. She looked at him, not past him, not through him, but at him if recognizing something deeper than survival. The cubs, unaware of the weight of the moment, nudged at her legs, eager but uncertain. She remained still. Daniel did not speak. There was nothing to say. Words would mean nothing to her, yet the silence between them spoke volumes. He had spent years studying animals, understanding their behaviors, their instincts. But this was something beyond mere observation. Finally, she moved. She nudged the door open with her massive head, the cold air rushing inside as she stepped out onto the snow-covered ground. The cubs followed closely, their small paws sinking slightly into the powdery surface. She took a few steps forward, then stopped. Slowly, deliberately, she turned back one last time. Their eyes met. There was no fear in her gaze, no lingering hesitation, only something else, something softer. It was not the human kind of gratitude, not something that could be explained or rationalized, but it was real, in its own way. A simple acknowledgement of what had been given and what had been understood. Daniel remained where he was, watching as she lingered for a few heartbeats longer. Then, without another glance, she continued forward, her cubs trailing behind her. He followed them only with his eyes, his breath steady despite the cold pressing in around him. He did not call out, did not take a step forward, did not try to hold on to what was never his to keep. The mother bear and her cubs disappeared into the trees, their forms swallowed by the vast wilderness that had always been their home. Daniel stood in the doorway long after they were gone, staring out into the snow-covered expanse. The world was quiet again, the storm nothing more than a memory, and the cabin once more belonged to him alone. A part of him felt the emptiness of their absence, but another part, perhaps the greater part, felt something else, something warmer than the fire that still burned behind him. He turned back inside, shutting the door gently behind him. The cabin was quiet once more, but he knew it was not the same place it had been before. Something had changed. Winter gradually loosened its grip on the land, the heavy snow melting into trickling streams that carved paths through the thawing earth. The once barren trees stretched toward the sky, their branches budding with the first signs of spring. Birds returned, their songs breaking the long-held silence of the frozen wilderness. Life, in its quiet resilience, pressed forward. Daniel remained in his cabin, his days passing with the familiar rhythms of solitude. He chopped wood, tended to his small garden as the soil softened, and watched the landscape transform. Yet, as the snow receded, so did the last traces of the storm that had brought them together. The bears had gone without a trace. He often found himself standing at the edge of the clearing, staring into the dense forest, wondering. Had they made it? Had the mother found food, kept her cubs safe, led them to where they could thrive? He had done what he could, but nature had its own rules, its own way of deciding who survived and who did not. Some days he told himself it was foolish to dwell on it. She was just an animal, guided by instinct, her memory of him likely faded into nothing. But other days, when the wind was still and the world seemed to hold its breath, he could almost believe that something more had passed between them. One morning, as he stepped outside to gather firewood, a movement at the tree line caught his eye. His breath hitched. There, standing among the trees, was the mother bear. Stronger, her fur sleek in the morning light, her body no longer burdened by the exhaustion of winter. And beside her, 3 cubs, no longer the frail creatures they had been, but sturdy, healthy, alive. She did not move closer, nor did he. There was no need. For a long moment, they simply looked at one another, the distance between them filled with understanding. She had survived. They had survived. Daniel felt a small smile tug at the corners of his lips. He did not expect gratitude. This was not the way of the wild. But she was here, lingering just long enough for him to see, to know. And then, just as silently as she had come, she turned. The cubs followed her, disappearing into the vast expanse of trees, their future unwritten but full of possibility. Daniel exhaled, feeling something settle deep within him. Kindness did not always make sense. It was not always logical or easy. But here, in the quiet of the wilderness, he knew it had mattered. It had made a difference. Even in the harshest places, compassion had a place. Nature was ruthless, but it was not without mercy. And sometimes in the unlikeliest of moments, a small act of kindness could change the course of a life.